Ripeto, la prima voglia che viene è quella di posizionare in occlusione abituale i modelli.
The first impulse you have is to position the models in an habitual occlusion and to lean them on the posterior base in order to see what is the movement of those models. This is the reality that indicates a very important issue. As we will see later on the evaluation of the data chart, this is not a real third-class case, but functionally can be defined as a second class. That means a third class with the function of a second class. We can later obtain this data from the depth of the palate, from the width of the arch of the superior maxilla, from the curves of the inferior maxilla. Therefore, this maxilla is taken backwards in respect to the superior maxilla, only because of a problem on the skull spine level. We should be able to detect the problem here. We can do that only if we analyze the models in details and if we report the data stated on the chart that we will see later. Anyway, if we position the model in an habitual occlusion, we can see clearly that we lose anterior verticality and we gain posterior verticality, which is common in second-class models. We can also see how the attitude of the skull spine on a postural level is in anti-flexion, which is not normal in third-class models. The mandible is kept backwards in respect to the superior maxilla. This tells us of the leveling that exists between the two bases of the posterior models. I would like to draw your attention to the fact that if we reduce the back measurement, we can see how the model doesn't fall and it lays on the top of the table. This is a very important hint for me. If I move slightly the model, it falls down. Therefore, I reckon that the problem is on the level of the seventh. We will cover the issue of the slipping between the sixth and the seventh molar on the verticality plane. It is important here to evaluate how there is an obstacle for the mandible to move backwards to its original position, and of the stray, the manifestation of a skull dysfunction, of which we have talked in our first meeting. E come questo strain dovrà essere risolto prima di poter realizzare un trattamento. We need to take into account also the strain before we can prepare an orthodontic treatment to reposition the mandible. With this presentation, I should be finished. I would like to briefly go over the models that we have been observing and also to have a look at the different cases we can encounter with these models. This is the first model, defined standard one, and we can see how the models keep the same verticality. There's no movement laterally, no rotation, and no movement. Then we have observed a second class, division 1. Here, the anterior verticality diminishes in respect to the posterior, and the models laid on the posterior plane have a certain movement and a certain special position. In particular, we have to observe how the superior arch have an inverse curve, while in the inferior maxilla there is an accentuated curve. In practice, a big space opens up here between the two arches. Then we have analyzed a second-class division 1. We can see how there is a strong overjet and overbite here, but one slide on the posterior base, these models tell us of the possibility of the advancing of the mandible in respect to the superior maxilla. The important aspect of these models is that they have a backwards movement, which doesn't happen if we look at this other case that has a strong overjet.
cosa che invece non avviene se andiamo a valutare questa che apparentemente ha un forte overjet come in questo caso. Però la differenza
The difference of this one is that when we lie our models, they stay still, so we must be able to figure out what is the difference between this case and this case, or this case, which means the difference between this, which is a second 2, in respect to this, that is a second 1, in respect to this one, which is a first class. The last models we looked at are third-class models. Here we have an important negative overjet. But we can also see how those models, once they have been positioned, reposition themselves in the space with a backwards movement on the level of the mandible. A particular attention has been given in this presentation to the fact that the main obstacle of these models in their movements is determined by the relation between the seventh superior with the seventh inferior. And we said that this verticality between the sixth and the seventh tells us about a defined skull dysfunction called strain, and particularly strain of height sphenoid.
Non ci rimane che analizzare dei modelli edentoli che affronteremo successivamente.